I run an organisation called the Climate Change Coaches, and we help people to get into climate action by changing mindsets. And before this, I was an executive coach working in C-suite boards, and I still do that, but I never mentioned anything bigger than their own needs. I never talked to them about things like climate, things like social purpose. Sometimes they talk to me about it, but my job was to be a coach. And I want to talk to you today about how the search for meaning and fulfillment in ourselves can actually help us to be more resilient in times of difficulty. When times are good, it's easy to make money, it's easy to do work, but we're learning from coronavirus that it is a little harder when times are hard. So I'm going to just sort of talk a little bit about what I mean by that. So what our team does is around climate change, clearly, but we've learned an enormous amount from the coronavirus epidemic or pandemic. I think what we've all realized is that we are living through an existential crisis, and climate crisis is no different to that. Whether we're talking about coronavirus and recognizing that what happens in China doesn't stay in China, that we are interconnected and interrelated, whether we're talking about climate crisis, and that might be here in Oxford with flooding, for example, it might not be at a sort of big picture world level, it may be localized crisis, and whether right now we're talking about what it's like to be a person of color, what it's like to be in the Black Lives Matter movement, and realizing that there are people in our society for whom existential crisis has been a fact of life for a very long time. In all of these cases, we are beginning to realize that we are only as included as the most marginalized, and we are only as rich as the poorest in our society. And that while we can run businesses and be really great with our staff, we can have really great relationships, we can look after them, we can be in fantastic relationship with our clients, we can make great products, but all of that will matter not one jot in a crisis when we realize that without the wider ecosystem working around us, perfectly good, perfectly sound businesses at an individual level will go to the wall. So what do we do? Well, what I noticed in the first few weeks of the coronavirus pandemic was people starting to say, wow, how is my business meaningful? What is my social imperative? And that's because this is a social crisis. Coming down the tracks will probably be environmental crisis. And we'll hear businesses say the same thing again. They'll say, well, what's the environmental imperative for operating? When I ran a business in West Africa, my last business before this one was in Sierra Leone. Very many businesses there would use the phrase, your social and environmental license to operate. So you had your government license, following the letter of the law, but actually if the people of the country didn't want you, or you destroyed the environment, that could see you sent out of the country, regardless of whether you were following the letter of the law. And I'd really love us in the UK to also think about those other criteria for being able to run our businesses. So how do we lead when the road ahead is uncharted? So I'm assuming that most of the people on this call are founders or senior in their businesses, or sole traders in their businesses. What we've just seen and what we're living through now is a huge period of uncertainty, and anyone managing staff through furlough is really, doing something quite heroic right now in trying to manage their own anxiety and hold that anxiety of their colleagues. And what I'm noticing is that many people are starting to question how we live and how we run the world. And for as hard as it's been for me to have my 4-year-old daughter at home while being pregnant, it has actually made us realize that we calibrated the balance between work and nursery a little bit wrong, and that actually she should have been home more. It has made my clients almost grieve the end of lockdown and say, oh, I'm really worried about going back to the commute and the 9 to 5 and losing something important. And fundamentally, it has made a lot of people question whether what they do really makes a difference in the world, really is necessary as a have to have when times are tough, as opposed to a nice to have, or even just something that makes money. There was some research that said 37% of employees in the UK didn't think their job made a jot of difference. And I'd actually be surprised if that number wasn't higher. And it made me think about that parable of the two guys building a wall in the lashing rain. They're building a perimeter wall and it seems to go on forever. And the first guy is really moaning about it. And he says, I have to build this awful wall and it goes on forever and it never stops. And the second guy's whistling. And they say to the second guy, well, why are you whistling? It's pouring with rain. And he says, oh, I'm building a cathedral. And I think for those of us that started businesses, we really felt we were building a cathedral. And so I really want to return you to that place of cathedral building, that part of you that lent into your talents and lent into your felt intuitive self at a time when you had no real knowledge about whether your business would succeed or fail. You took a leap of faith based on a feeling, not a thinking. And what I really want us to think about today is how we can rebalance our feeling selves with our thinking selves. Logic and data and knowledge are crucial. I'm not going to say they're not. And we have privileged them over emotion and feeling and instinct. And actually, all systems need to be in balance. So we can rebalance ourselves as part of our ability to tap into meaning, and that meaning can help us be more resilient. And I'll speak about that in a moment. So what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to sit in your chairs, or you can stand for this if you like. Put your feet on the ground. Sit back and take a deep breath. And drop anchor. Allow your breathing to go down in your body. Feel the ground, the earth holding you, and feel gravity anchoring you in place. And just take a moment to feel your back. And imagine looking backwards through yourself and back even further through the history of your life, and back even further again through the history of humankind, and way back millennia, past the dinosaurs that were here before us. There is a lot holding us in place. There's a lot we can lean back into. Just tip your head up slightly and look up to the horizon ahead. And as you take a deep breath in, really breathe into that place of trust in yourself. And to yourself in your own head, answer the question, who do I want to be when things are uncertain? And this grounding process, this kind of dropping anchor, is a really useful thing to do when you're feeling anxious, because anxiety rises in the body. And so if we can take deep breaths and relax our upper bodies, we can physically reduce our anxiety. But it's also a great way of reconnecting out of the head to the body and to what our felt selves want. And that might be important because there may be days when you feel like this. If we can balance our thinking and feeling selves, then we can start to respond from our hearts, not just our heads. Anyone on this call that works in marketing knows that we do better when we talk to hearts than heads. But meaning and fulfillment, while they may feel like a nice to have in good times, are actually crucial in a crisis. because they are the building blocks of our resilience, of our ability to get through it. And you only need to see that in the first few months of lockdown, first few weeks of lockdown, when people started to be furloughed, hundreds of thousands of people volunteered or offered to volunteer their time to charities. My next door neighbour works for a big name charity in the dementia space, and 700,000 people called them and offered them their time. We want to be useful. We want to feel purposeful and meaningful. And wouldn't it be great if we felt that way in our businesses, not outside of them? So to be fit for the future, we should now be asking ourselves, what is the social and environmental imperative of our work, so that we can easily find that foothold when the next crisis comes? Because there will be a next and a next and a next. We're only 12 years out from the financial crisis of 2008. The epidemiologists predict 4 pandemics this century. Throw in some climate crisis. Uncertainty is going to actually be the name of the game, not the anomaly. And when I talk to leaders in really big businesses, as I often do, they've been talking about how do we lead in uncertainty for a good couple of years in the sessions we run with them. I want to kind of reassure you, however, that this doesn't all mean you have to suddenly start running charities, because I really fundamentally believe that business has a massive role to play in the world, and a really useful one. You know, when we sell things, we know immediately whether our thing is useful and is meeting a need, because people don't buy it if it doesn't. So we have a really great feedback loop. And the Climate Change Coaches is a limited profit-making company, partly for that reason. I wanted to show you this company, which is run by a very old friend of mine from university. She was a TV producer for ITV and was really sick of dragging her really ugly bike panniers into ITV headquarters amongst all these kind of slick TV professionals. So she said, well, it must be a nice bag I can buy instead. And there wasn't. So she started a company to make them. And you know, she worked really hard to make sure that she could stand behind her brand, that it was ethical, that it was environmental, and that it was really well made and really well thought through. She designed the original bags completely herself. They've got all these really fantastic features for the cyclist that you'd never know about when you saw them in the boardroom. And it was really interesting watching how she responded and how her team responded to coronavirus, because they immediately knew how to speak to their sense of why they did what they did in the crisis. They immediately could make the connection between well-being and cycling, for example, and between, as the lockdown is now easing, between cycling safely as opposed to taking public transport. So it is possible to be a profit-making business and to feel a deep connection to why you do what you do, and to help all of your staff to feel that. So I'm going to just give you some questions to think about. So what social or environmental problem does your product or service currently solve? Have a think about, you know, what are you doing that really does serve the world? You know, when times are good, make money, but when times are bad, make meaning. So what is the meaning of what you do? And if you can't think of any, then maybe that's the time to pivot and find it. Ways to look for that is to think, well, what has a customer said of our business that makes us truly proud? It may be just a little nugget of something, but you can expand on that and get to something bigger. And then another really great one is, what do you want to tell your children that you achieved in your business? So, you know, a friend of mine has recently become a parent and said to me quite sadly, you know, my parents worked all hours God sends so that we could have a fantastic 2-week holiday every year. And I don't want that for my kids. I want to be around, you know, so we can focus in the wrong places for the right reasons. But actually, if we imagine the future and what our kids are going to turn around to us and say, you know, what do you want to say to them that you did? You know, it would have been really easy for me to stay coaching in the executive coaching world. But part of what motivated me to found the climate change coaches was wanting to be able to turn around to my daughter, and when she said, what did you do when you found out how bad it was, that I could say, I did something. I didn't just say someone else should do something. And then a really good thought experiment, because often you'll hear the phrase, I'd love to, but I've got to be commercial, which is basically our fear talking. If you didn't have to earn money from your work, what would you do with your time? Because we've actually seen that happen. As I said earlier, we've seen furloughed workers start to do stuff with their time because they don't have to earn money from their work right now, they're furloughed. So put that thought experiment to work for yourselves. If I could give you a guaranteed income, what would you do? And then it's really not a very hard leap to work out how you could make money doing that thing. And then the final piece is, what would motivate your staff to work for free? There's a massive myth that people work for money. And they really don't. I've even seen it in really, really well-paid places where people have said, actually, I would like recognition more than a bonus. And we know from research that people get bonuses and 2 weeks later, they still hate you. That bonus glow was short-lived. And that actually what they really want is meaning. What they really want is relationship and recognition and a sense of team. So maybe now is a time to pivot and find yourselves that. Fundamentally, what it really takes to manage to run a business in uncertain times is trust. Trust in ourselves, and trust in each other, and trust even in not knowing. And that's why I'm saying this morning that we really want to balance feeling and thinking, because knowing is something we all want. We want knowledge, we want expertise. It gives us a feeling of safety, but it comes from our thinking selves. Yet our feeling selves do trust. We do trust each other. We do trust our communities. And if we don't, we yearn to trust each other. And we've seen that when trust has been broken in the last few weeks, how much that affects and hurts people, how let down and disappointed people feel because they trusted. So fundamentally, this requires us to move from competition with each other to collaboration. To instead of trying to beat each other to sell stuff, to collaborating to solve real problems in the world. And to do that, we need to build our ability to trust in ourselves and trust in the ecosystem in which we operate. And to trust that if we look after that ecosystem, and that can be for us, Oxfordshire, or there may be people on this call from outside of the county, from outside of the country, wherever you are, trusting in that ecosystem means trusting that we don't need to compete. It means dialing down that little voice inside us that says, but, and wants to be kind of individualistic. It means leaning into the feeling, not the thinking side of ourselves. The side that trusts our loved ones, for example, and puts their needs ahead of our own. We already have access to that, but we've programmed it out of our work, and we can program it back in just as easily. And it closes the loop as to why emotional intelligence is important, because emotional intelligence is just another way of being connected to our emotional selves. And when we are able to connect to that sense of meaning and fulfillment and purpose, we're able to shift our mindset, and we're much better able to be resilient and agile when change happens. Often, when a crisis happens, we are asked to pivot our mindset at very short notice. We're asked to find wells of resilience from nowhere. Well, if we have a really good sense of what our business really does in the world and why it is necessary, relevant, and meaningful, we can use that to scaffold our personal and our company's resilience. So when times are tough, we can be part of the solution and part of the rebuilding, and not get sucked down and out of the picture.